All right. Welcome back to another story time session with your favorite sister, Shia, the Demon Slayer. So, continuing on with the origins of the heathens, confusion of faces. Uh, Now we are on the Amorites. Again, an article from Wikipedia. You can look into other articles if you like, but I'll start here and we'll continue on with whatever we find afterwards. Now, the Amorites, Sumerian, Romanized Martu, Akkadian, Amurun, or Tidnum. You have Emorai, and they were an ancient Northwest Semitic speaking people from the Levant who also occupied large parts of southern Mesopotamia from the 21st century BC to the end of the 17th century BC, where they established several prominent city states in existing locations such as Isin, Larsa, and later notably Babylon, creating the Old Babylonian Empire. The term Amurru in Akkadian and Sumerian text refers to the Amorites, their principal deity, and an Amorite kingdom. The term Amorite was never used in contemporary sources before the first millennium BC. The Amorites are mentioned in the Bible as inhabitants of Canaan, both before and after the conquest of the land under Joshua. The history, 3rd millennium BC. In two Sumerian literary compositions written long afterward, in the Old Babylonian period, in Merkar and the Lord of Arata, and Lugalbanda and the Anzud bird, the early dynastic ruler of Uruk, listed in the Sumerian king list, mentions the land of Martu. It is not known to what extent these reflect historical facts. There are also sparse mentions about Amorites, often as Mardu or Marduk, in tablets from the East Semitic speaking kingdom of Ebla, dating from 2500 BC to the destruction of the city in circa 2250 BC. From the perspective of the Eblaites, the Amorites were a rural group living in the narrow basin of the middle and upper Euphrates in northern Syria. For the Akkadian kings of central Mesopotamia, Martu was one of the four quarters surrounding Akkad, along with Subartu, Sumer, and Elam. Naram Sin of Akkad records in a royal inscription defeating a coalition of Sumerian cities and Amorites near Jabal Bishri in northern Syria circa 2240 BC. His successor, Shar Kali Shari, recorded in one of his year names in the year in which Zar Kali Sari was victorious over Amuru in the Jebel Bijri. By the time of the last days of the third dynasty of Ur, the immigrating Amorites had become such a force that kings such as Shu Sin were obliged to construct a 270 kilometer or 170-mile wall from the Tigris to the Euphrates to hold them off. The Amorites are depicted in contemporary records as nomadic tribes under chiefs who forced themselves into lands they needed to graze their herds. Some of the Akkadian literature of this era speaks disparagingly of the Amorites and implies that the Akkadian and Sumerian speakers of Mesopotamia viewed their nomadic and primitive way of life with disgust and contempt. In the Sumerian myth Marriage of Martu, written early in the second millennium BC, a goddess considering marriage to the god of the Amorites is warned. Now listen, their hands are destructive and their features are those of monkeys. An Amorite is one who eats what the moon god Nana forbids and does not show reverence. They never stop roaming about. They are an abomination to the gods' dwelling. Their ideas are confused. They cause only disturbance. The Amorite is clothed in sack leather, lives in a tent, exposed to wind and rain, and cannot properly recite prayers. He lives in the mountains and ignores the places of God, digs up truffles in the foothills, does not know how to bend the knee in prayer, and eats raw flesh. He has no house during his life, and when he dies, he will not be carried to a burial place. My girlfriend, why would you marry Martu? As the centralized structure of the third dynasty of Ur slowly collapsed, the city states of the south, such as Isin, Larsa, and Eshnuna, began to reassert their former independence, and the areas in southern Mesopotamia with Amorites were no exception. Elsewhere, the armies of Elam were attacking and weakening the empire, making it vulnerable. Ur was eventually occupied by the Elamites, remaining until ejected by Isin ruler Ishbi-Era, marking the beginning of the Isin-Larsa period. Second millennium BC, after the decline of Ur III, Amorite rulers gained power in northern Syria. For the Akkadian kings of central Mesopotamia, Martu was one of the four quarters. Oops, hold on. Sorry. After the decline of Ur III, Amorite rulers gained power in a number of Mesopotamian city-states, beginning in the Isin-Larsa period and peaking in the Old Babylonian period. In the north, the Amorite ruler of Ekalatum, however, Shamshi Adad I, conquered Assur and formed the large, though short-lived kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia. In the south, Babylon became the major power under the Amorite ruler Sumu-La'el and his successors, including the notable Hammurabi. In the east, the Amorite kingdom of Merai arose, later to be destroyed by Hammurabi. Babylon itself would later be sacked by the Hittites and its empire assumed by the Kassites. To the northeast, Yamhad ruled, later to be destroyed by the Hittites in 16th century BC. The city of Ebla, under the control of Yamhad in this period, also had Amorite rulership. There is thought to have been an Amorite presence in Egypt beginning in the 19th century BC. The 14th dynasty of Egypt, centered in the Nile Delta, had rulers bearing Amorite names, such as Yakbim. Furthermore, increasing evidence suggests that the succeeding Hyksos of Egypt were an amalgam of peoples from Syria, of which the Amorites were also part of. Based on temple architecture, Manfred Beitak argues for strong parallels between the religious practices of the Hyksos at Avaris with those of the area around Byblos, Ugarit, Alalak, and Tel Brak, defining the spiritual home of the Hyksos as in northmost Syria and northern Mesopotamia, areas typically associated with Amorites at the time. In 1650 BC, the Hyksos established the 15th dynasty of Egypt and ruled most of Lower and Middle Egypt contemporaneously with the 16th and 17th dynasties of Thebes during the chaotic Second Intermediate period. The Amorite era ended in Mesopotamia with the decline and fall in the 16th century BC of Babylon and other Amorite cities. The Kassites, who had been in the region for a century and a half, occupied Babylon and reconstituted its empire. In the far south of Mesopotamia, the first Sea Land dynasty took power. Later, the Mitanni and Assyria rose as powers. From the 15th century BC onward, the term Amurru is usually applied to the region extending north of Canaan as far as Kadesh on the Orontes River in northern Syria. After the middle of the second millennium BC, Syrian Amorites came under the domination of first the Hittites and, from the 14th century BC, the Middle Assyrian Empire. They then appear to have been displaced or absorbed by a new wave of semi nomadic West Semitic speaking peoples, known collectively as the Alamu during the Late Bronze Age collapse. The Arameans rose to be the prominent group amongst the Alamu. From circa 1200 BC on, the Amorites disappeared from the pages of history, though the name reappeared in the Hebrew Bible. Language. The language was first attested in the 21st, 20th centuries BC and was found to be closely related to the Canaanite, Aramaic, and Semalian languages. In the 18th century BC at Marai, Amorite scribes wrote in the Eshnuna dialect of East Semitic Akkadian language. Since the text contained Northwest Semitic words, forms, words, and constructions, the Amorite language is thought to be a Northwest Semitic language. The main sources for the extremely limited extant knowledge of the Amorite language are the proper names and loan words, not Akkadian in style, that are preserved in such texts. Amorite proper names were found throughout Mesopotamia in the Old Babylonian period, as well as places as far afield as Alalak in Syria and modern day Bahrain or Dilmun. They are also found in Egyptian records. Ugaritic is also a Northwest Semitic language and is possibly an Amorite dialect. Religion. A bilingual list of names of 10 Amorite deities alongside Akkadian counterparts from the Old Babylonian period was translated in 2022. These deities are as follows. Dagon, who is identified with Enlil. Dagon was the supreme god in many cities in the upper Euphrates, especially at sites such as Marai, Tutul, and Turka. Babylonian texts refer to the chief god of the Amorites as Amurru, Ilu Amurru, or Martu, corresponding to their name for the ethnic group. They also identify his consort as the goddess Asheratum. Camis, or Camis, an otherwise poorly attested deity largely known from Akkadian and Amorite theophoric names. He was significant at Ebla, where a month was named after him. The bilingual identifies him with the god Ea, though other god lists identify him with Nergal. Ateratum, whose name is cognate with Ashira and is identified with Belet Ili. Yarahum, the moon god, who is named Yarik at Ugarit, he is identified with the Mesopotamian Sin. Rasapum, equated with Nergal and also known from Ebla, a god with an incompletely reconstructed name, possibly Aram, who is identified with Isun. Halamu, identified with Subula, a deity in the netherworld god circle. Hanatum, who is here identified with Istar. Pydre or Pidre, previously known only from the late Bronze Age Ugaritic text and later in the bilingual list, she is identified with Nanaya. Asti ul Ha'alti, who is identified with Ishtaran, the tutelary deity of the city of Dur. This list is not thought to represent a full Amorite pantheon, as it does not include important members such as the sun and weather deities. The biblical Amorites. The term Amorites is used in the Bible to refer to certain highland mountaineers who inhabited the land of Canaan, described in Genesis as descendants of Canaan, the son of Ham, Genesis 10:16. They are described as a powerful people of great stature, like the height of the cedars, Amos 2 and 9, who had occupied the land east and west of the Jordan. The height and strength mentioned in Amos 2 and 9 has led some Christian scholars, including Orville J. Nave, who wrote the Nave's Topical Bible, to refer to the Amorites as giants. In Deuteronomy, the Amorite king Og was described as the last of the remnants of the Rephaim, Deuteronomy 3:11. The terms Amorite and Canaanite seem to be used more or less interchangeably, Canaan being more general and Amorite a specific component among the Canaanites who inhabited the land. The biblical Amorites seem to have originally occupied the region stretching from the heights west of the Dead Sea, Genesis 14:7, to Hebron, Genesis 13:8, Deuteronomy 3:8, 4 and 46 through 48, embracing all Gilead and all Bashan, Deuteronomy 3 and 10, with the Jordan Valley on the east of the river, Deuteronomy 4:49, the land of the two kings of the Amorites, Sihon and Og, Deuteronomy 31 and 4, and Joshua 2 verse 10 and 9 verse 10. Sihon and Og were independent kings whose people were displaced from their land in battle with the Israelites, Numbers 21 verses 21 through 35. Though in the case of the war led by Og of Bashan, it appears none of them survived and the land became part of Israel. Numbers 21, verse 35. The Amorites seem to have been linked to the Jerusalem region, and the Jebusites may have been a subgroup of them. Ezekiel 16, verse 3. The southern slopes of the mountains of Judea are called the Mount of the Amorites, Deuteronomy 1, verse 7, 19, and 20. The book of Joshua speaks of the 5 kings of the Amorites were first defeated with great slaughter by Joshua, Joshua 10, verse 5. Then more Amorite kings were defeated at the waters of Merom by Joshua, Joshua 11, verse 8. It is mentioned that in the days of Samuel, there was peace between them and the Israelites. 1 Samuel 7, verse 14. The Gibeonites were said to be their descendants, being an offshoot of the Amorites who made a covenant with the Hebrews. 2 Samuel 21, verse 2. When Saul later broke that vow and killed some of the Gibeonites, God is said to have sent a famine to Israel. 2 Samuel 21, verse 1. The origin. There are a wide range of views regarding the Amorite homeland. One extreme is the view that Martu, Mate Amorim, covered the whole area between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean Sea. The Arabian Peninsula included. The most common view is that the homeland of the Amorites was a limited area in central Syria, identified with the mountainous region of Jebel Bishri. Genetics. Scortanioti et al. 2020 conducted ancient DNA analysis on 28 human remains dating to the Middle and Late Bronze Age from Tel Achkana, ancient Alalak, a city which was founded by Amorites and contained a Hurrian minority later on, which the authors called an Amorite cultural assemblage. The analysis found that the inhabitants of Alalak were a mixture of Copper Age Levantines and Mesopotamians, and were genetically similar to contemporary Levantines from Syria or Ebla and Lebanon or Sidon. Racialism. The view that Amorites were fierce, tall nomads led to an anachronistic theory among some racialist writers in the 19th century that they were a tribe of Aryan warriors who at one point dominated the Israelites. The theory originated with Felix von Luschan and did fit then current models of Indo European migration. Luschan later abandoned this theory. Houston Stewart Chamberlain claimed that King David and Jesus were both Aryans of Amorite extraction. The argument was repeated by the Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg. However, the Amorites certainly spoke exclusively a Semitic language, followed Semitic religions of the Near East, and had distinctly Semitic personal names. Their origins were believed to have been the lands immediately to the west of Mesopotamia in the Levant or modern Syria, and so they are regarded as one of the Semitic peoples. Amorite states in the Levant, the Amurru kingdom, Ebla's third dynasty, Mukish, Qatna or Katna, Ugarit, and Yamhad. In Mesopotamia, Andarig, Apum, First Babylonian Dynasty, Ikalatum, Kurda, Marais Lim Dynasty, Tebetu, Kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia, in Egypt, the 14th dynasty of Egypt, and possibly the 15th dynasty of Egypt. And that concludes the Amorites. Now, the Perizzites. The Perizzites in Hebrew, Perizzi, are a group of people mentioned many times in the Bible as having lived in the land of Canaan before the arrival of the Israelites. The name may be related to a Hebrew term meaning rural person. The history and biblical mentions of Perizzites extend from the time of Abraham, Genesis 13, verse 7, to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra 9, verse 1 to 2. According to Michael Lefebvre, Ezra's reference to the Perizzites does not imply that a group still known as Perizzites existed in the land in Ezra's time. It is instead to be understood as a literary reference by Ezra to passages such as Exodus 34, verses 11 through 16, Exodus 33, verse 2, and Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 through 5, which prohibited intermarriage with a variety of non Israelite peoples, including Perizzites, among others. The time during which Perizzites were most in conflict with the Israelites seems to be the time of Joshua into the early period of the Judges. According to the book of Joshua, the Perizzites were in the hill country of Judah and Ephraim. Joshua 11, verse 3, 17, verses 14 to 15. According to 1 Kings 9, verse 21, they were enslaved by Solomon. According to Hittitologist Trevor R. Bryce, the Perizzites cannot be linked to any peoples or lands known from extra biblical sources, but there are speculative links to the Hivites and the Jebusites who may have originated from a region called Quay or Qui in Assyrian sources, or Q or Koa in biblical sources. Jewish Encyclopedia entry. A Canaanitish tribe settled in the south of Canaan between Hor and Negeb, although it is not mentioned in the genealogy in Genesis. According to the biblical references, Abraham, when he entered Canaan, found the Perizzites dwelling near the Canaanites, and God promised to destroy both these peoples. Jacob reproved his sons because of the crime of Shechem, inasmuch as he feared the Perizzites and the Canaanites. Moses promised the Israelites to bring them unto the place of the Perizzites and the Amorites in Exodus, and a later time the tribes of Simeon and Judah conquered the Canaanites and the Perizzites in Judges. The Perizzites were among the tribes that were not subjected to the tribute by Solomon in 1 Kings. while the complaint was brought to Ezra that the priests and the Levites would not separate themselves from the Perizzites and the other peoples of the land. The view was formerly held that the Perizzites were a prehistoric tribe which became assimilated to the Canaanites when the latter invaded Canaan. But this is in contradiction to the fact that the Perizzites are not mentioned in the genealogy. More recent commentators are of the opinion that the names Perizzi or Perazzi are identical, and that the Bible has included under the name Perizzite all stocks dwelling in unwalled towns. The Hivites. The Hivites in Hebrew, Hiwim or Hiwim, were one group of descendants of Canaan, son of Ham, according to the table of nations in Genesis 10, verse 17. A variety of proposals have been made, but beyond the references in the Bible to Hivites in the land of Canaan, no consensus has been reached about their precise historical identity. The etymology, E.C. Hostetter has proposed that the name comes from tent dweller as a cognate to the Hebrew word hawa, which means tent camp, although this proposal is rejected by John Day. No name resembling Hivite has been found in Egyptian or Mesopotamian inscriptions, though the Hayawa in a Luvian Phoenician bilingual has been linked to the biblical Hiwi. Location. The Hivites, according to the book of Joshua, lived in the hilly region of Lebanon from Lebo Hamath, Judges 3 and 3, to Mount Hermon, Joshua 11 and 3. Hivites are also mentioned further south in the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible, which assigns to Hivites the towns of Gibeon, Kephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim, Joshua chapter 9, verse 17. However, the Septuagint reads these four towns as inhabited by Horites, suggesting that the name Hivite may have entered the Masoretic text via a spelling error. The Masoretic text of Joshua chapter 11, verse 3 described the Hivites as being under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. However, the Septuagint reads Hittites in place of Hivites, suggesting that one text or the other has suffered an error. Similarly, in 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 7, according to the Masoretic text, Hivites are mentioned immediately after the stronghold of Tyre, where the Septuagint once again reads Hittites. Biblical mentions. Within the Hebrew Bible, Hivites are often listed among the inhabitants of Canaan, promised to the descendants of Abraham in Genesis chapter 36, verse 2. In the Masoretic text, mentions that one of Esau's wives was Aholibamah, the daughter of Anah, the daughter of Zibeon the Hivite, who is also described as of the daughters of Canaan. However, textual evidence from the Septuagint and Genesis 36, verse 20, suggests that Zibeon was originally referred to not as a Hivite, but a Horite. The book of Joshua claims that Hivites were one of 7 groups living in the land of Canaan when the Israelites under Joshua commenced their conquest of the land. Joshua chapter 3, verse 10. These 7 nations were to be exterminated: Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. In Joshua chapter 9, Joshua ordered the Hivites of Gibeon to be wood gatherers and water carriers for the temple of Yahweh. See Nethinim for more info. The Bible records that David's census included Hivite cities. During the reign of Solomon, they are described as part of the slave labor for his many building projects. It is not clear if, when, or how they ceased to be a separate group before the Israelite kingdoms came to an end. See also Mizpah in Gilead, where the Hivites were said to live. The Jebusites, modern Yebusai, Ybusi, were, according to the books of Joshua and Samuel from the Tanakh, a Canaanite tribe that inhabited Jerusalem, then called Jebus or Yebus, trampled place, prior to the conquest initiated by Joshua in Joshua chapter 11, verse 3, and chapter 12, verse 10, and completed by King David in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 6 through 10. Although a majority of scholars agree that the book of Joshua holds little historical value for early Israel and most likely reflects a much later period. The books of Kings as well as First Chronicles state that Jerusalem was known as Jebus prior to this event. First Chronicles chapter 11 verse 4. The identification of Jebus with Jerusalem is sometimes disputed by scholars. According to some biblical chronologies, the city was conquered by David in 1003 BCE. Identification of Jebus. The identification of Jebus with Jerusalem has been disputed, principally by Niels Peter Lynch. Supporting his case, every non biblical mention of Jerusalem found in the ancient Near East refers to the city as Jerusalem. An example of these records are the Amarna letters, several of which were written by the chieftain of Jerusalem, Abdi Heba, and called Jerusalem either Uruzalem, Uruzalem, or Uruzalem, 1330s BCE. Also in the Amarna letters, it is called Beth Shalem, the house of Shalom. The Sumero-Akkadian name for Jerusalem, Uruzalem, is variously etymologized to mean foundation of or by the god Shalem. From Hebrew Semitic Yari, Y-R-Y, to found, to lay a cornerstone, and Shalem, the Canaanite god of the setting sun and the netherworld, as well as of health and perfection. Lemche states, there is no evidence of Jebus and the Jebusites outside of the Old Testament. Some scholars reckon Jebus to be a different place from Jerusalem. Other scholars prefer to see the name of Jebus as a kind of pseudo ethnic name without any historical background. Theophilus G. Pinchas has noted a reference to Yabusu, which he interpreted as an old form of Jebus, on a contract tablet that dates from 2200 BC. The ethnic origin. The Hebrew contains the only surviving ancient text known to use the term Jebusite to describe the pre-Israelite inhabitants of Jerusalem. According to the Table of Nations in the book of Genesis, chapter 10, the Jebusites are identified as a Canaanite tribe, which is listed in third place among the Canaanite groups, between the biblical Hittites and the Amorites. Prior to modern archaeological studies, most biblical scholars held the opinion that the Jebusites were identical to the Hittites, which continues to be the case, though less so. However, an increasingly popular view, first put forward by Edward Lipinski, professor of Oriental and Slavonic Studies at the Catholic University of Leuven, is that the Jebusites were most likely an Amorite tribe. Lipinski identified them with the group referred to as Yabusium in a cuneiform letter found in the archive of Marai, Syria. Lipinski also suggested that more than one clan or tribe bore similar names, and thus that the Jebusites and Yabusium may have been separate people altogether. In the Amarna letters, mention is made that the contemporaneous king of Jerusalem was named Abdi Heba, which is a theophoric name invoking a Hurrian mother goddess named Hebat. This implies that the Jebusites were either Hurrians themselves or were heavily influenced by Hurrian culture, or were dominated by a Hurrian Marianu class, a Hurrian warrior class elite. Moreover, the last Jebusite king of Jerusalem, Arana or Warna or Ornan, bore a name generally understood as based on the Hurrian honorific Ewir, Ewir. Richard Hess, 1997, points to four Hurrian names in the Bible's conquest narrative: Piram, king of Jarmuth, and Hoham, king of Hebron, Joshua 10, verse 3, and Shishai and Talmai, sons of Anak, Joshua 15, verse 14, with Hurrian based names. The biblical narrative. The Hebrew Bible describes the Jebusites as dwelling in the mountains besides Jerusalem. In Exodus, the good and large land flowing with milk and honey, which was promised to Moses as the future home of the oppressed Hebrew people, included the land of the Jebusites. According to the book of Joshua, Adonai-Zedek led a confederation of Jebusites and the tribes from the neighboring cities of Jarmuth, Lachish, Eglon, and Hebron against Joshua, but was soundly defeated and killed. However, Joshua chapter 15, verse 63 states that Judah could not dislodge the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the people of Judah. In Judges chapter 1, verse 21, portrays the Jebusites as continuing to dwell at Jerusalem within the territory otherwise occupied by the tribe of Benjamin. Most modern archaeologists now believe that the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites under Joshua did not represent an external invasion, but that the Israelites originated as a subculture within Canaanite society. Some biblical scholars believe that the accounts in the book of Joshua, compiled in about 600 BC, represent a collection of folk memory of various conflicts with which would have occurred over a time period of over 200 years, 8th to 7th centuries BC. According to the second book of Samuel, the Jebusites still had control of Jerusalem at the time of King David, but David wished to take control of the city. Understandably, the Jebusites contested his attempt to do this, and since Jebus was the strongest fortress in Canaan, they gloated that even the blind and lame could withstand David's siege. According to the version of the story in the Masoretic text, David managed to conquer the city by a surprise attack, led by Joab, through the water supply tunnels. Jerusalem has no natural water supply except for the Gihon spring. Ever since its discovery in the 19th century, Warren's Shaft, part of a system which connects the spring to the city, has been cited as evidence for the plausibility of such a line of attack. However, the discovery at the turn of the 21st century of a set of heavy fortifications, including towers, around the base of the Warren's Shaft system and the spring, has made archaeologists now regard this line of attack as implausible, as it would be an attack against one of the most heavily fortified parts and hardly a surprise. The account in First Chronicles mentions the advantage of a speedy attack but does not mention use of the water shafts, and according to many textual scholars, the claim in the Masoretic text could simply be a scribal error. The Septuagint version of the passage states that the Israelite had to attack the Jebusites with their daggers rather than through the water shaft. The books of Kings state that once Jerusalem had become an Israelite city, the surviving Jebusites were forced by Solomon to become serfs. Though, since some archaeologists believe that the Israelites were simple, an emergent subculture in Canaanite society, it is possible that this is an archaeological explanation for serfs rather than a historically accurate one. It is unknown what ultimately became of these Jebusites. According to the Jebusite hypothesis, however, the Jebusites persisted as inhabitants of Jerusalem and comprised an important faction in the kingdom of Judah, including such notables as Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Bathsheba, the queen and mother of the next monarch, Solomon. According to this hypothesis, after the disgrace of a rival Elite faction of priests in the struggle for succession to David, the family of Zadok became the sole authorized Jerusalem clergy, so that a Jebusite family monopolized the Jerusalem clergy for many centuries before becoming sufficiently attenuated to be indistinguishable from other Judeans or Judahites. The first book of Chronicles states that the inhabitants of Jebus forbade King David from coming to Jerusalem shortly after he was made king. Joab went up first and took the city and became chief and captain of David's armed forces. Individuals named in the Bible. Melchizedek. Jerusalem is referred to as Salem rather than Jebus in the passages of Genesis describing Melchizedek. According to Genesis, the ruler of Salem in the time of Abraham was Melchizedek. Also, Melchizedek, same thing. And that as well as being a ruler, he was also a priest. The medieval French rabbi Rashi believed that Melchizedek was another name for Shem, son of Noah, despite Abraham's supposed descent from the line of Shem's son Arphaxad. Later, Joshua is described as defeating a Jebusite king named Adonizedek. The first parts of their names mean king and lord, respectively, but though the Zedek part can be translated as righteous, making the names my king is righteous and my lord is righteous. Scholars are uncertain, however, whether Melchizedek was himself intended in the Genesis account to be understood as a Jebusite rather than a member of another group in charge of Jerusalem prior to the Jebusites. Melchizedek, as a priest as well as king, was likely to have been associated with a sanctuary, probably dedicated to Zedek, and scholars suspect that the Temple of Solomon was simply a natural evolution of this sanctuary. Arana, another Jebusite, Arana, referred to as Ornan by the books of Chronicles, is described by the books of Samuel as having sold his threshing floor to David, which David then constructed an altar on, the implication being that the altar became the core of the Temple of Solomon. Arana means the Lord in Hittite, and so most scholars, since they consider the Jebusites to have been Hittite, have argued that Arana may have been another king of Jerusalem. Some scholars additionally believe that Adonijah is actually a disguised reference to Arana, the R having been corrupted to D. The argument originated from Cheyenne, who, prior to knowledge of the Hittite language, proposed the reverse. The narrative itself is considered by some scholars to be atheological and of dubious historicity. The Jebusite hypothesis. Some scholars have speculated that as Zadok does not appear in the text of Samuel until after the conquest of Jerusalem, he was actually a Jebusite priest co opted into the Israelite state religion. Frank Moore Cross, professor at the Harvard Divinity School, refers to this theory as the Jebusite hypothesis, criticizes it extensively, but terms it the dominant view among contemporary scholars. In Canaanite myth and Hebrew epic, essays in the history of the religion of Israel. Elsewhere in the Bible, the Jebusites are described in a manner that suggests that they worship the same God, El Elyon, as the Israelites, Melchizedek. Further support for this theory comes from the fact that other Jebusites resident in pre-Israelite Jerusalem bore names invoking the principal or god Zedek, Tezedek, as Melchizedek and Adonizedek. Under this theory, the Aaronic lineage ascribed to Zadok is a later anachronistic interpolation. Classical rabbinical perspectives. According to classical rabbinical literature, the Jebusites derived their name from the city of Jebus, the ancient Jerusalem, which they inhabited. These rabbinical sources also argued that as part of the price of Abraham's purchase of the cave of the patriarchs, cave of Machpelah, which lay in the territory of the Jebusites made Abraham grant them a covenant that his descendants would not take control of Jebus against the will of the Jebusites. And then the Jebusites engraved the covenant in bronze. The sources state that the presence of the bronze statues are why the Israelites were not able to conquer the city during Joshua's campaign. The rabbis of the classical era go on to state that King David was prevented from entering the city of Jebus for the same reason, and so he promised the reward of captaincy to anyone who destroyed the bronzes, Joab performing the task and so gaining the prize. The covenant is dismissed by the rabbis as having been invalidated due to the war the Jebusites fought against Joshua. But nevertheless, David, according to the rabbis, paid the Jebusites the full value of the city, collecting the money from among all the Israelite tribes so that the city became their common property. In reference to 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6, which refers to a saying about the blind and the lame, Rashi quotes a midrash which argues that the Jebusites had two statues in their city, with their mouths containing the words of the covenant between Abraham and the Jebusites. One figure depicting a blind person represented Isaac, and the other depicting a lame person representing Jacob. The modern usage. The politicians Yasser Arafat and Faisal Husseini, among others, have claimed that Palestinian Arabs are descended from the Jebusites in an attempt to argue that Palestinians have a historic claim to Jerusalem that precedes the Jewish one, similar to the more common Palestinian Arab claim that they are descended from the Canaanites. Thus, the 1978 Al-Mawsu'at Al-Philistiniya, or the Palestinian Encyclopedia, asserted the Palestinians are the descendants of the Jebusites, who are of Arab origin, and described Jerusalem as an Arab city because its first builders were the Canaanite Jebusites, whose descendants are the Palestinians. There is little historical, genetic, cultural, or archaeological evidence to support the claim of Jebusite Palestinian continuity. Professor Eric H. Klein of the George Washington University Anthropology Department asserts that a general consensus exists among historians and archaeologists that modern Palestinians are more closely related to the Arabs of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Jordan, and other countries than to the Jebusites, and that they lack any significant connection to them. The late Johns Hopkins University professor William F. Albright questioned the surprising tenacity of the myth of the unchanging East and rejected any assertion of continuity between the folk beliefs and practices of the modern peasants and nomads and pre-Arab times. Okay, that ends the Jebusites. I think there's one more. I want to go over the Horites next and the wives of Esau. So continue to stay tuned. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Peace.